So here we go. So, Trevor, welcome to FilmFellas. Thank you so much for taking some time to come and talk to us about Your Forgotten Great. Before we introduce Your Forgotten Great and you tell us more about it, why don't you tell us more about you and your passion for film?
Okay, well, a lot of my passion for film we'll actually talk about later in our conversation. As a kid, I love my dad, who was very busy, like most dads are, worked a lot. And my parents had more children than the old woman in the shoe. So if I got to spend time with my father, it would be on a Saturday, and there was on public television a thing called Matinee at the Bijou. So I would sit and watch TV with my dad, and that began my love of the cinema. And then as I got older, I found a contact in China that had movies that you could not watch in America, such as Lone Wolf and Cub series, et cetera, et cetera. And then for about 20 years, I wrote a movie column. And I think I've seen more movies than is healthy.
You and me both, Trevor. You and me both. So why don't we start off? Why don't you introduce your Forgotten Great and tell us the reason why you've chosen this movie?
Okay, the movie I've chosen is A Road to Perdition, starring Tom Hanks and Paul Newman. It was Paul Newman's last film. Brief overview of the film. It tells the story of a mobster and his lieutenant, and something goes very wrong in the film, and they have to reconcile it as the film goes on to keep it vague.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Do keep it vague because I agree with you. This is an absolutely fantastic movie, and definitely up there as one of Sam Mendes' best. So, without further ado, why don't you introduce or tell us your three reasons why you feel that people should go out and check this movie? What's your first reason?
The first reason is cinematographer Conrad Hall. For those of you not familiar with Conrad Hall, he was nominated 10 times for an Oscar and he won three. He's done such famous films as In Cold Blood, The Professionals, Electric, Electra Glide in Blue, which is a great, great film that nobody knows about. Um, with Newman, he did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in Cool Hand Luke and Harper. And this might be the best film he has ever done. As his last film before he died 6 months after it was released. It it's easily his best film, and I always say that people should find a director or a star and watch everything they did in a year because you start to see growth in maturity. With this film, you see a master at his best with Conrad Hall and Sam Mendes, who was coming off the Oscar for American Beauty. When he he was advised not to hire Conrad Hall. He was too slow, too old, too grouchy, didn't like new technology. All these reasons he was told, don't hire this old man. And with American Beauty in this film, he did a wonderful job because Conrad Hall is also one of the last few cinematographers who worked in both black and white and color and moved back and forth and back and forth. And this film, in many ways, could have been a black and white film. In fact, one of the signatures of a Conrad Hall film is the colors are muted. So when something happens, the color pops. And at the end of this film, you'll notice You go from dark and shadows to everything pops right at the end for a reason. And his Conrad Hall's father was a writer, and that's originally what Conrad Hall wanted to do, was be a writer. And he failed. He failed at school, and so he decided to try film. And just happened to draw out of a hat on his first film, cinematographer, and that's how he became a cinematographer. So it's total accident that he became probably the greatest cinematographer in the history of Hollywood. Um,
Amazing story, amazing story. So, and then that leads us nicely on to your second reason. What's your second reason why people need to check out this movie?
the second reason is it's based on a graphic novel by Max Allan Collins, who lives in Iowa. I live in Iowa. Max Allan Collins lives in the Quad Cities. I have seen him. He's originally from Muscatine, Iowa. I have seen him several times in Des Moines. I've never bothered him because you don't want to bother someone when they're with their family out in public. But I've seen him probably 4 or 5 times out in public, and I always want to go, Max Allan Collins, the man who wrote Dick Tracy for years in the comic strips. And you can trace the roots, even though it's a fictional story, you can trace the roots of this story into a graphic novel series, manga series called Lone Wolf and Cub. If you have a lot of time on your hands, there are 28 volumes to Lone Wolf and Cub. It's been made into 6 films, TV series. It's very influential. Uh, Maybe the most famous person in influence, and you probably might have seen one of his movies, is Frank Miller. If you read Frank Miller at all, you can see Lone Wolf and Cub in it. So he took this paradigm that's Lone Wolf and Cub, which is an adult with a child. In the Lone Wolf and Cub, it's a disgraced samurai with his infant son. Here it's a mobster on the run with his young boy. So he um, Lone Wolf and Cub picks that up, and he also picked up, because Max Allan Collins studies history, he picked up the local mobsters and used them as, even though it's a fictional story, used them as examples. So the Paul Newman character, whose name is Rooney in the movie, is in real life was named Looney. Um, and his Tom Hanks, who plays his lieutenant in the movie, named Michael Sullivan Sr., he was Dan Drost. And if you go, I don't know why you would want to go to Rock Island, Illinois, but if you go to Rock Island, Illinois, you can still take a tour of the places where Looney operated. He had over 150 whorehouses, gambling dens, liquor establishments. He basically ran that little area. And one of my relatives, he rode shotgun on the liquor shipments that would go from Iowa to Chicago. So my cousin's grandfather. One day, my cousin came across a photograph of his grandfather with a machine gun. His dad was so horrified by that he had found that the picture disappeared. But that's family legend, and not much is written about these mobsters in these small cities like Rock Island, Illinois, which is a river town. And in real life, there was a fight between the two. There was a gang war, and Conrad Connor Looney was killed in a car when he was talking to his father. And that's the character played by Daniel Craig in the movie. So he took all these real characters and made a fictional story out of them.
What a fabulous backstory and fleshing out of it there is. Can I ask you a question? Because obviously we've gone from Conrad Hall to talking about the graphic novel briefly. Do you think that the graphic novel had a huge influence on the choice of cinematographer, but also the style of cinematography?
Somewhat.
Hmm.
Conrad Hall is, if you look at Conrad Hall's stuff, you'll see what I call common tropes that he uses. Every movie's different that he does, but harsh light, the use of shadows, the use of rain, the use of reflections, like in Cool Hand Luke, the reflection off the man with no eyes glasses. You see reflections in this movie twice. And smoke, the use of smoke, cigarette smoke. It's just Conrad Hall is one of the things he said is you should be able to watch a movie he did and know the plot with no volume. So if there's no sound, you can figure out the plot of the movie just by watching his visuals. And how much of all of these are Conrad Hall and how much of them are Sam Mendes is up for debate, as it is with anybody. But you can see common tropes. He called it magic naturalism. He was like in, for example, I'll use an example, the use of light. If you watch In Cold Blood, Conrad Hall has this wonderful scene where it's raining and the rain is hitting the pane, and Robert Blake looks like Robert Blake is crying because the rain is reflecting off his face. So he uses these common tropes to emphasize the story and the use of color, lack of color, so that when things start to change, it pops. Like in American Beauty, the use of red, that just pops out because he takes that palette down. Because again, he started out making black and white films, and he's the last real American cinematographer to have cut his teeth on black and white films.
So that's reasons one and two, and
Yeah.
what two great reasons there are. What's your third and final reason why people need to check out Road to
Okay.
Perdition?
The third reason is you would assume that this is a mob film, and a lot of people don't want to watch a mob film. In fact, Conrad Hall didn't want to do the film because he doesn't like violence. He said, I don't want to do this film. But then he realized, no, it's really the universal story of fathers and sons. That you have Michael Sullivan Sr. and Michael Sullivan Jr. And if you look at Michael Sullivan Jr., he lies, he gambles, he fights. This little boy does bad things. He's like his dad. And there comes a moment in the film, I'm not going to give anything away, and it happens to almost every young man, where you suddenly realize your father is not the man you thought he was. And in this one, it's a very tragic, sad moment in this little boy's life when he suddenly realizes my dad is much different than I thought he was. And I would point out two things that confirm that this is all about fathers, the universal story of fathers and sons. One, in the story, the Paul Newman character, his son is Daniel Craig, Connor, in the story. Well, every time the Sullivans are showing love, either by Mr. Rooney or show love between each other, notice how focus goes out. All of a sudden, the Daniel Craig character is isolated. Everything else goes out of focus, or he goes out of focus. The second one is distance. Throughout the movie, and I don't know if people have really paid attention to it, the Sullivans are never close. When they're eating at the table, the boy is at a distance. When they're in the car, the boy is in the back seat. But at one moment in the film, the father confesses something that's very hard for him to confess about why he hasn't loved his son like he should. And all of a sudden, that closeness comes. And it's a beautiful scene, beautiful scene. So I would say the third reason is it's the universal story of fathers and sons. It's not a mob film. That
And
I
I
think
think
that
that
hurts.
that brings us nicely on to a question then about the choice of director and about Sam Mendes originally, who was the original director or set to be the original director of this movie, because from what I believe, Spielberg was considering it for a while, and
Yeah.
Spielberg absolutely loves, we've seen it in Jurassic Park, we've seen it in Indiana Jones, we've seen it more recently in The Fabelmans. He always has some kind of family dynamic,
Mhm.
fathers and sons, fathers and mothers, etc., within his film. So this really has all the makings of a perfect material for Spielberg.
Yeah, it did. That Spielberg did have the rights to it. His plate was too full. And Mendes picked up the graphic novel and said, I want this to be, again, he's coming off an Academy Award win. He's the hottest director in Hollywood. And he sees this book, this graphic novel, which people poo poo graphic novels all the time. He saw something in it. He saw this universal story of fathers and sons about, again, another line in the movie. The Paul Newman character says, sons are put on this earth to disappoint their fathers. And and the opposite side is Tom Hanks, who says, who's when he's talking to, again, his father is the Paul Newman character in many ways. And Paul Newman says, we're all going to go to hell. And he says, Michael doesn't have to. The boy doesn't have to. He wants better for his son than what he was. And it's just a beautiful, to me, that's the universal story in the movie. The beauty of Conrad Hall's cinematography, I think it's his best film. The universal story of fathers and sons. It's, as I said, it's, if you're going to go into this thinking it's a mob movie, you're going to be disappointed because it's more than a mob movie.
I guess, Trevor, before we wrap this up, one of the things I wanted to discuss with you as well was, let's talk about some of the performances as well, because you've got Jude Law, in this movie, who's really playing against type within this.
Oh,
Certainly not a pretty boy. You've got Daniel Craig, who hadn't really done much before this. He'd done some BBC TV, but I think he hadn't done Layer Cake yet, but he had done Lara Croft. And I guess most famously, you've got Tom Hanks playing against type as well.
oh yeah. Well, I think that's what hurt the film in the long run. Tom Hanks is basically the modern day Jimmy Stewart. People want to go to see, you don't want to see Jimmy Stewart with a machine gun, and you don't want to see Jimmy Stewart. And let's be honest, Michael Sr. in the movie is not a nice man. He is an awful human being. You don't want to see Jimmy Stewart being an awful human being. You don't want to see Tom Hanks being an awful. And Tom Hanks beefs up for the role. He puts on a lot of weight. He gets a prosthetic nose. So they when they hired Jude Law, here's this handsome guy. How do you make Jude Law threatening to this beefy Tom Hanks character? You make him weaselly. And supposedly, from everything I've read, Jude Law hated doing the film because he thought he looked so ugly throughout the filming. But he's dangerous because he's got that weaselly. He can move at any second. Look to him. So he he's threatening to Tom Hanks because he's the weasel against the bulk. The two reasons to me it failed, I mean, it's not failed, but people haven't given it the due it deserves.
Hmm.
It's one, again, everybody's playing against type. Tom, everybody loves Paul Newman, and Paul Newman's a bad guy too. Everybody's a bad guy. Every adult's going to hell. And the second reason is I don't think most people know what the word perdition means. So when you see Road to Perdition in the movie, it's not only a town, it's eternal punishment. Every adult is going to be eternally punished in this movie. I think that there's that famous story of the madness of King George the Third. In America, they had to call it the madness of King George because they thought Americans would think it was a sequel. I think the same is true with Road to Perdition. People saw the title, don't know what the title means.
Yeah. Well, it was also, yeah, I mean, I think there's loads of cases, isn't there, of films having to be retitled. I mean, famously back in the early 80s, even though it was a sequel, but because the film hadn't been released in America, there was Mad Max 2, which was actually in America just called The Road Warrior.
Yeah, I
You
saw
know,
it.
yeah. And so, you know, you're right, though. I do think Road to Perdition as a name, it doesn't trip off the tongue, and it doesn't get you necessarily excited, does it, as a title? But
I honestly don't. I honestly believe most Americans don't know what perdition is. And if you don't know what it is, why do I want to see this film? I want to see Tom Hanks romancing Meg Ryan. I want to see Tom Hanks landing a plane on the Hudson River. I don't want to see him be a bad man. So what would make you want to go see this film? And what should make you want to go see is it's beautiful. It picks up, as I said, very few films pick on that theme of fathers and sons. This is a rare exception because I always say mothers like to smother their children to death. Fathers give great distance. And this is a story about a father who's terrified his son's going to be him. And he doesn't, that's the one thing he doesn't want. And it's a beautiful story about beautiful people. And to me, as I said, shot beautifully. It's I, as much as I love the graphic novel, I think the movie's better because they were able to focus. The graphic novel, they couldn't focus as much. There's 6 of them, I think. I think there's 6 different graphic novels total. With here, they're able to focus on that story and cut out everything that's not needed, so that it hits you harder when you realize what Michael Jr. is going through. When you at the end, oh, tragedy.
well, let's not spoil the ending.
I'm not spoiling anything because you don't know what happens. But as I said, to me, if anybody who's a father with that generation, especially with that generation of men, saying I love you to your child, hugging your child, that's very difficult.
Yeah. And I think in that way as well, it also therefore has similarities with Cormac McCarthy's The Road, you know, which is, you know, similarly a father and son story, but in a different sense. That one's more about survival and you know, preparing his son for when he won't be there. You know, where Road to Perdition, by your take, is about a father making sure that his son won't follow in his footsteps.
And Michael Jr. has every reason to be following his dad's footsteps. All he needed was the Paul New. Michael Sr. had the Paul Newman character to guide him. As the beginning of the film, which is giving nothing away, he says, Mr. Rooney gave us a home. Mr. Rooney put clothes on our back. Mr. Rooney fed us. So his father, the quote unquote, his father, then the Rooney character, takes him down the wrong path. He doesn't want that for his son.
Brilliant. Trevor, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for reaching out to FilmFellas. Thank you so much for sparing your day to kind of talk to us about Road to Perdition. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad let me give you guys a compliment. I'm glad that you guys are trying to get people to love films that have been forgotten or not seen as much as they should be. Right now, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, there is a painful lack of good storytelling right now. And you have all this gold out there. And if you can turn somebody on to one of these films, you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Thank you very kindly. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Okay, bye.